The first thing Alara Voss noticed about Nebraska was the silence. Not the absence of sound. The train had been loud enough, all iron and steam and the grinding complaint of wheels against track for 3 days straight. It was something else, something in the quality of the air itself, the way sound seemed to leave the moment it was made, swallowed by the flat expanse of winter grass, stretching in every direction, without apology, without end. Boston had never been silent. Even at 3 in the morning, even in the smallest hours, the city breathed. Ships in the harbor, horses on cobblestone, the distant argument of neighbors through thin walls. Alara had grown up believing that silence was simply the absence of things worth hearing. Nebraska taught her differently inside of 10 minutes. She stood on the platform at Broken Bow with her daughter's hand in hers and 2 traveling cases at her feet. And she looked out at the land the way a person looks at something they cannot quite make themselves believe is real. January 1886. The sky was the color of old pewter, low and close, pressing down on the earth like a lid. The grass was the color of nothing, not brown, not gold, just the color of things that had been alive and weren't anymore. And in every direction, as far as she could see, there was more of the same. More sky, more grass, more silence. Willa pressed close against her hip. 4 years old and already wise enough to know when her mother needed steadying. "Is this it?" Willa asked. "Not yet," Alara said. "Close." She didn't know if that was true. She didn't know much about where she was going, only what the advertisement had told her, which wasn't much, and what she had read between the lines of Desmond Holt's 2 letters, which told her more than he'd intended. A gentleman rancher, the advertisement had said. Good land, established operation, seeks capable wife for companionship and household management. She had understood the word capable in the way a woman who has been poor understands most words as a requirement, not a preference. He wanted someone who would work. She had written back anyway. She had written back because the alternative was returning to her mother's house in Cambridge with a 4-year-old and 14 months of widow's grief and not enough money to make herself a guest rather than a burden. She had written back because Frederick, her husband, had left her with a name that meant something and a bank account that meant nothing, and because the cough that had taken him in the autumn of 1884 had done its work with the indifferent efficiency of something that didn't know. It was destroying a life. She had written back because Willa needed to eat and grow, and one day stand somewhere and call it hers. And Alara could not manufacture that possibility out of the air of a city that had already decided what kind of woman she was. So she had answered the advertisement. She had been honest in her letter. She always was. It was both her greatest quality and her most persistent inconvenience. She had written that she was 23, widowed, in good health. She had written that she had a daughter 4 years old named Willa who was likewise in good health and was, by her own possibly biased assessment, an exceptionally sensible child. She had written that she was not romantic about the arrangement and expected he wasn't either, and that she was prepared to be useful in every way a wife could reasonably be expected to be useful. He had written back within 2 weeks. Brief, formal, correct. He would cover her travel. She should arrive before February. She had not let herself think too hard about what she was walking into. Thinking too hard had never served her. You saw the door, you opened it, you walked through. Everything else was just weather. The station agent, an older man with a tobacco-stained mustache, told her someone would be coming for her. She waited. Willa sat on one of the traveling cases and occupied herself with the serious business of counting the boards in the platform floor, which Elara found comforting in a way she couldn't have explained the child's capacity for making any situation into something manageable. Something with numbers and order and a definite end. She heard him before she saw him, not footsteps. The platform was weathered wood and absorbed sound, but the particular quality of someone's attention. The way the air changes when a person is looking at you and hasn't decided yet what to say. She turned. He was tall, which she noted the way she noted useful information. Dark hair under a battered hat that had been a better hat some years ago. Trail clothes that had been clean but not recently pressed. He was perhaps 27, with the kind of face that looked older at first and younger when he turned a certain way. Jaw set, eyes steady. A mouth that suggested it knew how to smile but wasn't doing it now. He stood with the economy of a man who had learned that unnecessary movement is wasted movement. And he held his hat in his hands the way men do, when they've been raised to take it off in the presence of a lady and haven't forgotten it yet. "Mrs. Voss," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "Callum Rhett. I work for Mr. Holt." He looked at Willa, who had stopped counting boards and was regarding him with the frank assessment that 4-year-olds bring to new people. "This is the young one, Willa," Elara said. He looked at Willa for a moment, not the quick, dismissive glance of someone cataloging an inconvenience, but the genuine look of a person trying to understand something. Then, without apparent self-consciousness, he crouched down to her level, which brought him eye to eye with her rather than looming above her, and said, "Long trip." Willa considered this. 3 days, she said, and one night where the train was very loud. "The grade near Grand Island," he said. "Always loud there. You hungry?" Willa looked at her mother. "She is," Elara said. "We both are." He stood, picked up both traveling cases before she could reach for them. "There's a place near the station. We'll eat before we go. It's 2 hours out, and Mr. Holt doesn't keep much in the way of provisions in the cold months." They walked. Elara noticed that he carried both cases without commentary and without any performance of effort, and that when Willa's shorter legs brought her to the edge of the boardwalk, where a gap between boards was wide enough to catch a small boot, he shifted his weight to one hand and held out the other for Willa to take without being asked. Willa took it. Elara filed this away in the careful accounting she had been keeping since the moment she'd stepped off the train, not tallying against him, just tallying. Information. She had learned to collect information before she committed to an interpretation. The restaurant, such as it was, occupied the front room of a building that also appeared to be someone's house, and possibly a feed store. They ate salt pork and boiled potatoes and bread that was 3 days old, but still better than nothing. And Callum Rhett drank black coffee and said very little. He didn't ask her about Boston. He didn't ask her about Frederick or how she'd come to be answering advertisements in Nebraska papers. He asked once if the food was all right. She said it was. He nodded. That was the extent of the social portion of the meal. She appreciated it more than she would have appreciated any amount of polite interest. When they stepped back outside, the sky had shifted from pewter to something darker at the western edge, the gray deepening toward the color of a bruise. Ilara looked at it and felt the pull of something she didn't have a name for. Not dread exactly, not hope. Something between those two things, something that lived in the space where a person knows a change is coming and hasn't yet decided how to feel about it. "Weather?" she asked. Callum glanced west. "Tonight, not a bad one. Cold." The wagon was a working wagon, no concessions to comfort, just function. He helped her up first, then Willa loaded the traveling cases in the back, with a neatness that suggested habitual care. The horse was a sorrel patient and broad-backed and moved out of town at a pace that was efficient rather than urgent. They rode mostly in silence for the first hour. Willa fell asleep against Ilara's arm, her weight small and warm and trusting. And Ilara looked at the landscape moving past them and tried to understand what she had agreed to. The land was not beautiful in any way she had been taught to recognize beauty. It was flat and enormous and winter dead, and the occasional farmstead they passed looked less built than place dropped into the grassland, without the surrounding context of hills or trees or anything that might make a human structure feel like it belonged. But there was something to it, some quality she couldn't name. The sky was bigger than any sky she'd seen before, genuinely enormous in a way that made her feel both very small and somehow unexpectedly less crowded than she'd felt in months. "You're from Boston," Callum said. Not a question this time either. An observation offered to the middle distance, not demanding anything back. "Cambridge," she said. "Near enough. First time west of Ohio. First time west of Albany." She paused. "Is it always like this?" "Like what?" She considered. "Like the edges have been taken off everything." He glanced at her sidelong and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Winter does that. Summer's different." She wanted to ask how, but Willa shifted in her sleep and the moment passed and Callum returned his attention to the horse, and they rode the remaining hour in a silence that was not unfriendly. The ranch came into view just as the light began to fail. The low profile of buildings against the dimming sky, a barn, a bunkhouse, a main house that was larger than she'd expected. 2-story with a covered porch running across the front. Fenced paddocks empty in winter. Smoke from the main house chimney. The smell of horses and hay and wood ash. Callum drew the wagon up to the front of the house and set the brake. "I'll get your cases," he said. "You'll want to go in." Ilara didn't go in immediately. She stood for a moment in the last gray light and looked at the property the way she'd learned to look at things, not romantically, not with dread, just looking, trying to see it as it was not as she feared it might be or hoped it might become. A working ranch, a going concern. Someone had built this carefully over time with intent. She could see it in the condition of the fencing, the placement of the barn relative to the prevailing wind, the way the house was set back from the road, at precisely the distance that offered privacy, without isolation. Someone had thought about this place. That was something. She picked up Willa and carried her toward the front door. The interior of the house was warm, which she hadn't expected or hadn't let herself expect. There was a fire in the main room, and the furniture was heavy and dark and old. The furniture of a man who had accumulated things over decades rather than selected them. A large table, several good chairs, shelves with ledgers and a few books. On the wall, a surveyor's map of the county with pencil markings in several places. Everything was clean in the way of a place that is clean to a standard rather than cared for. A distinction Ilara recognized immediately. Desmond Holt was standing near the fire when she came in. He was 52, perhaps 53. A large man, broad in the chest with white hair gone silver at the temples, and the careful grooming of someone who believes that appearance is a form of argument. He was dressed well better than the occasion seemed to warrant, which was its own kind of information. His face was the face of a man who had been handsome, and still carried the structure of it. The bones arranged in a way that commanded a certain automatic deference from a room. He looked at her with eyes that were an unremarkable gray and were doing, she noticed, a great deal of very rapid calculation. "Mrs. Voss," he said. His voice was measured, pleasant, the voice of a man who had practice at being easy to listen to. "You've had a long journey. Welcome to Holt Ranch." "Thank you," she said. "This is my daughter Willa." He looked at Willa, or rather, and this was the thing. She registered quickly, carefully, filing it in the same account where she kept all information that mattered. He looked in Willa's direction without quite focusing on her, the way a person looks at furniture they've decided not to buy. A fraction of a second, no more. But Ilara had been watching faces her whole life, had grown up in a household where you learned to read what people weren't saying, because what they were saying was rarely the whole story. She didn't miss it. Willa, for her part, looked at Desmond Holt with the unfiltered assessment of someone who has not yet learned that it is impolite to look at people as though you are solving them. She said nothing. She pressed slightly closer to Ilara's side. "You'll be tired," Desmond said. "Callum will show you your room. We can speak more in the morning." The room was off the kitchen. Ilara understood this immediately, and she took the understanding and put it somewhere cool and practical inside herself, where she kept the things she needed to remember without letting them make her careless. The room was clean. It had a window, a bed, a chest of drawers, a hook on the wall. It was not a guest room. It was not a wife's room. It was the room nearest the stove, nearest the water pump, nearest the place where the work of a house was done. Someone had anticipated exactly what she would be for and put her there accordingly. She set Willa down on the bed and took off the child's boots. Willa was nearly asleep again, the deep, uncomplicated sleep of children on long trips. Ilara covered her with the blanket that was folded at the foot of the bed and stood for a moment looking at her daughter's face. That face so familiar and so separate from her, so complete in itself, a whole person who needed to eat and grow and be kept from harm. She was thinking about the room. She was thinking about the look that hadn't landed. She was thinking about the advertisement which she had read so many times that she had it memorized. "Gentleman rancher seeks capable wife." No mention of the kitchen. No mention of the work. No mention of the life being offered, only the qualities being required. She was thinking about the gap between what a person says and what they mean. She had built her survival on understanding that gap. She wasn't angry. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. But she was clear. She was clear in the way that a person becomes clear when they stop hoping for a thing to be different than it is and start simply looking at what it is. She would learn more in the morning. She was woken before dawn by the sounds of the house coming to life, the stove being stoked, water being drawn, the particular creaking of old wood contracting in the cold. She lay still for a moment in the dark, listening, locating herself in the sequence of sounds, and placing herself in relation to them. Then she rose, dressed in the dark so as not to wake Willa, and went to find the kitchen. It was not yet light outside. The window above the pump showed nothing but black and a faint silver edge at the horizon. That was the suggestion of dawn rather than the thing itself. Ilara put the kettle on and found the coffee and the cups and the means of making bread, all of which required a certain amount of opening drawers and cabinets with the quiet efficiency of someone mapping new territory. She had the coffee made and the bread started when she heard a sound from outside. Not the bunkhouse, which was further off, but nearby. The porch, possibly, or the side yard. She looked out through the kitchen window and saw in the first gray light of morning coming in fast from the east, Callum Rhett crouched at the edge of the yard, talking to her daughter. She hadn't heard Willa get up. She stood at the window without moving. Willa had found the doorway to the outside the kitchen door unlatched because Ilara had been careless and wandered into the pre-dawn dark the way small children do, without fear and without plan, attracted by something she would not have been able to name if asked. She was standing in the frost-stiff grass at the edge of the yard, in her nightdress and her socks, which were already wet from the ground. And she was looking up at something. Callum was beside her. He had come from the direction of the barn. His coat was on. His hat was in his hands, which meant he'd taken it off somewhere in the last few seconds. And he was crouched down to her level the way he'd done at the station, making himself smaller and less alarming, and he was pointing at the sky. The sky was remarkable, Ilara realized. The stars were still out in the west, where the dark held on, and they were the kind of stars you don't see east of the Ohio River. The kind that exist in numbers that seem implausible, that make the sky look not black, but deep blue-black, layered as though the darkness itself has depth. She couldn't hear what he was saying. She could see his mouth moving, could see Willa's face tilted up with the expression she got when someone was telling her something. She wanted to keep, not just hear, but keep. He pointed at one cluster, then another. His voice, when a fragment of it reached her through the kitchen glass, was low and even, the voice of someone who has explained something many times and found the right words for it. Ilara stood at the window for longer than she should have. She was cataloging still, that was what she told herself. Gathering information. Learning the shape of the place she had come to. But there was something in the scene outside the glass that asked her to simply watch it, and for once she let herself. She went back to the bread when Willa's toes were clearly getting cold enough to require intervention. She heard the kitchen door open a few minutes later, heard Callum's boots stop at the threshold, heard him say to Willa in that same low voice, "You'll want dry socks before breakfast." And then the particular shuffling sound of a child being sat on a step and having her wet socks removed. She did not turn around. She was watching the bread. Callum came to the kitchen doorway. "She wandered out," he said. "Didn't know if you knew." "I saw. Thank you." A pause. Coffee's good. Help yourself." He did and took it with him back toward the barn, and Alara let out a breath she hadn't been tracking and put her hands flat on the counter for a moment and felt the cold of the stone beneath them and understood that she was going to have to be very careful about how much she let herself notice things. Breakfast was the formal introduction she had been anticipating. Desmond Holt, at the head of a table that was slightly too large for two people, was a different man than Desmond Holt standing near a fire. He was in his element here in his house, at his table, occupying a space that was organized entirely around his comfort and convenience. He spoke well. He asked her questions about Boston and about the journey, and he listened to her answers with the attentive patience of a man who is skilled at appearing interested. He did not speak to Willa. This was not, Alara thought, a man who disliked children in any active sense. It was something subtler and in some ways worse. He simply didn't register them as relevant. Willa sat at the table and ate and looked at things with her particular quality of attention, and Desmond moved around her presence the way water moves around a stone in a stream. Not hostile, just unaffected. When the meal was done, he produced papers. The papers were what she had expected, a marriage contract of the informal kind that such arrangements produced in this part of the country at this time, witnessed and notarized, but not the thing that novels were written about. He handed her a pen and indicated where she should sign. She read every line first, which he did not comment on. Then she signed. Callum, who had come in from the cold for this purpose alone and was standing near the door with one hand resting on the frame. The way a man stands when he's agreed to be present for a thing, but not to be part of it, stepped forward to add his witness signature. Alara watched him sign. She had sharp eyes, always had. Her father had called it her best feature and her worst habit. And in the moment that Callum's pen moved across the paper, she saw the name he wrote. It was not Callum Rhett. She looked at the name for only a second, then looked away. She did not look at him. He did not look at her. Desmond was already folding the papers with the efficiency of a man who considers a thing done once the paperwork is complete. Winter on the ranch had a rhythm she learned over the following days, the way she learned most things, by observation, by doing, by the gradual accumulation of pattern. She was awake before Desmond. She built the fire, made the coffee, prepared the meals. She cleaned the kitchen and the main room and the room that served as Desmond's office, and she did all of this without comment or complaint, because complaint required either an audience that cared or an alternative that was available, and she had neither. Desmond was not unkind in any way she could point to directly. He ate what she cooked and said it was adequate. He told her where things were kept when she asked. He gave her a small budget for provisions and explained the store accounts in town. He treated her with the formal distance of a man who has hired someone and has not yet decided whether the hire is satisfactory. Not warmth, not contempt, just evaluation. He did not look at Willa. Callum was different in his absence than in his presence. She noticed this about him, that the spaces he left behind were somehow more informative than his actual behavior. A stack of extra wood appeared beside the kitchen door before the temperature dropped 2 nights running. A bucket of fresh milk sat on the porch step 3 mornings a week from the single cow the ranch kept through winter, though no one had told her she could use it for more than cooking. These things arrived without announcement, and without expectation of thanks, she gave none. He seemed to neither want nor need it. What she knew of him at the end of that first week was this: he was competent at every task she'd seen him attempt. He was economical with words in a way that was not rudeness but discipline. He treated Willa as though she were a person, which was more than she could say for the man she had married. And his name on legal papers was not the name he used. She was not afraid of this information. She was curious about it the way she was curious about the land, with a careful, managed attention that she kept pointed in the right direction and away from anything it might damage. One afternoon in the second week, she put Willa down for a nap and walked out to the barn with a legitimate errand. She needed to know where the tallow was kept, because the candles in the kitchen were running low, and she had not yet found the supply. She found Callum in the barn working over a harness that needed restitching, his movements precise and absorbed. She asked about the tallow. He told her. He pointed to the correct shelf. She didn't leave immediately. This was unusual for her. She rarely stayed in a place without purpose, but she stood in the barn door with the cold at her back and said, "You've done this a long time. Ranch work." He didn't look up from the harness. Long enough. Where before here? A pause. Wyoming, Colorado, Kansas. Not Nebraska originally. No. A beat. You Boston born, before that nowhere particular. She looked at the harness work. It was careful, exact, the stitching even and tight. How long at Holt's? 7 months. She nodded. Filed it. Said, "Thank you for the milk." He looked up then briefly, and she saw something in his face that was not surprise exactly, but was the look of a person who has been given more credit than they expected, which told her that credit was not a currency he received often. "Didn't want it to go to waste," he said. She went back inside. The crisis, when it came, arrived without the warning she might have expected. She had learned to read Desmond's moods in the way you learn weather, not predicting it exactly, but recognizing the signs that preceded it. He was better on the days when the weather was good enough to keep him out of the house. He was worse when he was inside with his ledgers and his account books, and the particular friction of finances that did not add up to what he believed they should. It was a Wednesday evening, the third week of her arrival. Desmond had been with his ledgers since mid-afternoon. She had kept Willa quiet and to the kitchen side of the house, which she had taken to doing as a general practice. Not from fear, she told herself, but from the reasonable management of variables. Dinner was over. She was washing the dishes. Willa was on the kitchen floor with 2 wooden spoons and a pot lid, conducting some private investigation into the properties of sound which under other circumstances would have been tolerable, but which Desmond, passing through the kitchen doorway, found otherwise. He stopped in the doorway, looked at Willa, looked at the pot lid. "She's been inside all day," he said. His voice was the kind of flat that precedes things. "It's 17 degrees outside Mr. Holt. There's a barn." Ilara set down the dish she was washing. She turned around. She did this slowly and deliberately because she had learned that the pace at which a person turns around tells the room something about how they intend to proceed, and she wanted the room to have correct information. "Willa will sleep in the house," she said, "in the room we've been given. She will do so tonight and every night. That is not a negotiation." Desmond looked at her. His expression did not change, which was its own kind of statement. The expression of a man who does not often need to adjust, because the world adjusts to him. The arrangement, he said, was for a wife, not a nursemaid situation. The arrangement, Elara said, was described to me in writing. I have the letters. I can produce them. Nowhere in those letters is there any specification about where my daughter sleeps. This was true. She had read the letters many times. She had read them with exactly this conversation in mind, because she had understood from the beginning that this conversation was coming. She had not known when, but she had known it was coming the moment she'd walked into this house and been put in the room nearest the kitchen. Desmond's jaw tightened. Fractionally, she saw it. There's a practical matter, he began. There is one practical matter, Elara said. My daughter sleeps in the house. Everything else we can discuss. The silence between them was not comfortable. It was the silence of a calculation being run on both sides, both people adding up what they had and what they were willing to spend. She heard the front door open, heard boots on the floor of the main room. The specific weight of them, the particular cadence she had learned to recognize in 2 weeks without deciding to learn it. The boots stopped at the kitchen doorway. Callum Rhett stood there with his coat on and cold air still coming off him, the way a person looks when they've come from outside and haven't yet had time to plan what to do with their hands. He was still. He looked at Elara, then at Desmond, then at the space between them, with an attention that gathered everything in it without appearing to. He didn't speak. He walked in, not toward Desmond, not confrontationally, not with any gesture that could be named as interference. He simply moved into the kitchen and stood beside Elara in the way that a person stands beside someone they have decided to stand beside, and the message of it was delivered without a word having been spoken. Desmond looked at both of them. He was a man who understood leverage and calculation, and in this moment, his calculation told him something he didn't like, that making this particular argument tonight in this particular kitchen would cost him more than it was worth. He could find another cook. He could not find another foreman in January in Harlan County with Callum Rhett's particular set of skills, and he was not a man who confused his pride with his interests. He turned and went back to his ledgers. The kitchen was quiet. Willa had stopped her investigation of sound and was watching the two adults with the serious eyes of a child who has learned to read a room. Elara looked at Callum. He looked at the doorway Desmond had gone through. Then he poured himself what was left of the evening coffee, took it, and went back outside without a word. Elara stood for a moment in the middle of the kitchen with her hands still damp from the dishwater, and understood several things at once. She understood that she had won something tonight, and it would be held against her. She understood that the man who had just stood beside her had done it not from gallantry and not from instruction, but from some private conviction that she could not yet name. And she understood this most of all. And she was honest enough with herself not to pretend otherwise, that she was going to have to be very careful about how much she allowed herself to notice Callum Rhett. Because she was noticing him. She had been noticing him since the station in Broken Bow, where he had crouched down to talk to Willa without being asked. She had been noticing him since the kitchen window in the pre-dawn dark, when he had shown her daughter the names of stars in a voice that was quieter than the cold. She had been married before. She knew what it cost to trust someone with the important things. She knew the specific arithmetic of what you spent and what you got back and what was simply gone. She was not ready for that arithmetic again. She was not sure she would ever be, but she picked up Willa from the floor and held her close for a moment, feeling the small weight of her, the trust of her, that completely unconscious trust that children have before they learn they shouldn't. And she thought one thing at a time. Tonight the child sleeps in the house. Tomorrow is its own problem. Outside, the January wind came across the Nebraska grassland from the north, steady and indifferent and enormous. Inside, the fire settled in the stove with the sound of something making itself comfortable for the long night ahead. One thing at a time, February came in hard and stayed. The temperature dropped to places that the thermometer on the porch could measure, but the body couldn't quite believe, and the ranch contracted around its own warmth the way living things do when the cold gets serious. Everything pulled inward, everything conserved. The cattle moved closer to the windbreaks. The horses stood in the barn, with their breath making small clouds in the dark. Even the sound of the wind changed, going from the broad, sweeping presence of January to something leaner and more deliberate, as though it had shed everything unnecessary and was down to pure intention. Elara learned the cold the way she was learning everything else here, by living inside it until she understood its logic. She learned that the fire needed feeding twice in the night, and that the difference between a kitchen that was warm by 6 in the morning and one that was not was entirely a matter of the last feeding at 2 a.m. She learned that Willa's hands needed double wrapping before the walk to the outhouse, and that the water in the pump could be coaxed with patience, but not with force. She learned the specific silence of a house, where everyone has learned not to expect more than the house is offering. Desmond had not addressed the matter of Willa's sleeping arrangements again. He had addressed it in other ways, by adding to her list of daily tasks, by finding reasons to require her presence in parts of the house that kept her busiest and furthest from Willa by the small and unverifiable erosions that a person with authority can inflict, without ever saying anything that could be repeated in a court of law. She cataloged all of it. She kept her accounting. She did the work and did it well because doing it badly would have given him something actionable, and she was not going to give him that. She was also learning him. This was a project she undertook with the same deliberateness she brought to everything. Not with enmity, not with anything she would have named as strategy, but with the plain, practical intention of understanding the forces she was living among. Desmond Holt was a man who had built something with discipline and will, and the kind of sustained effort that deserves a certain respect, even when the man deploying it does not. He had come to Nebraska territory in the 1860s with money from somewhere back east that he never discussed, and had turned it into a going concern through 20 years of hard decisions. He was not stupid. He was not irrational. He was simply a man who had organized the entire world around himself for so long that he had lost the capacity to see where he ended and everything else began. His ranch was not a place where other people lived. It was a projection of his will, and the people on it were extensions of that will valued in precise proportion to their usefulness. He didn't think of himself as cruel. That was what made him dangerous in the specific way he was dangerous. the complete absence of the self-awareness that might have put a limit on things. Callum continued to leave things at the kitchen door without explanation. An extra cord of split wood after a week when the temperature dropped below zero 3 nights running. A tin of salt which they'd been running low on. A small paper bag of dried apples one morning that Willa discovered before Alara did and carried around the kitchen, holding it with both hands, as though it were something precious, which it was. Each thing appeared and required nothing in return. Not thanks, not acknowledgement, not even the confirmation that it had been received. This she didn't examine, not yet. But she noticed it, and the noticing accumulated the way all important things accumulate quietly and without permission. On a morning in the second week of February, she went to the general store in town with the provision budget Desmond allocated each month. And Callum drove the wagon because Desmond had told him to, and because it was the kind of day where a woman driving a wagon alone 8 miles in 20-degree weather was a practical problem rather than a matter of propriety. They rode in the usual silence, which was by now a silence she had learned the texture of, not empty, not tense. Just the particular quiet of two people who have decided not to waste words on weather and have not yet found the subject that would justify breaking it. About a mile out of town, Willa, who had been sitting between them on the bench with the self-contained gravity she brought to wagon rides, pointed at the sky and said, "That cloud looks like a horse." Callum looked. He said. "Back legs are wrong." Willa looked again more critically. "It's a horse lying down." "That's better." A pause. Alara felt something shift very slightly in the composition of the air around them. "How do you know so much about stars?" Willa asked him. He considered the question with the seriousness he apparently applied to all of Willa's questions. "My uncle. He worked cattle in Kansas for 30 years. Didn't have a watch, didn't need one. Navigated by stars and knew the time by them. Taught me when I was young." "Were you younger than me?" "Older, about 8, I think." "I'm 4. Willa said with a tone suggesting this was information he might want. "I know. I could learn stars now. You already started. 3 nights ago, you learned Orion." Willa looked at the sky tracking. Alara looked at the horizon ahead. She was aware of her own stillness, the specific quality of attention she was paying to a conversation she was not part of. And she thought about what it meant that Callum had remembered what Willa learned 3 nights ago, in the pre-dawn cold. And then she put that thought back in its folder and kept her eyes on the road. "Your uncle in Kansas," she said, before she'd entirely decided to speak. "Did you grow up there? A beat. Not a long one, but a beat that had weight." "Dodge City," he said. "For a time." He didn't offer more. She didn't push, but she filed the geography away next to the name on the marriage papers, and the two things sat together in her accounting and began the slow process of becoming related to each other. Deputy Ren Cole arrived on a Wednesday. Alara heard the horse first, a single horse, not the ranch horses whose sounds she'd learned to distinguish by now, but an unfamiliar gait coming up the road from town at a pace that was purposeful rather than urgent. She was in the kitchen with flour on her hands and the midday bread half made when she heard Desmond's voice from the front porch, and then another voice lower and less familiar. She did not go to the window immediately. She finished what she was doing with the bread shaped the loaves, covered them, set them aside, and then, with the economy of movement she developed for navigating the house's acoustics, she moved to the far end of the kitchen where the wall abutted the parlor, and the plaster was thinnest. She could hear adequately well. The deputy's name was Cole. He was looking for a man from Dodge City, Kansas. He said this in the measured way of someone repeating a formal description who had gone by the name Edmund Vare. The case was 9 years old, he said, which he acknowledged was a long time, but there had been a complaint from an insurance company in Kansas City that had retained his office last spring, and the trail had gone cold in Colorado, and then picked up again in Nebraska through a land registry discrepancy that he described in terms that were more bureaucratic than interesting. Edmund Vare, suspected involvement in the arson of a commercial warehouse in Dodge City in the winter of 1877. One fatality. Desmond told the deputy he didn't know anyone by that name. He said this without hesitation, without curiosity, and without offering anything further. He did not name Callum Rhett. He had suspicions the name discrepancy on the payroll ledger a rumor carried back from Broken Bow, but suspicions without documentation were currency he couldn't spend yet. He would wait until he had something solid. Cole rode out 10 minutes later. Elara went back to the bread. Her hands were steady. She kneaded the dough with the same rhythm as before, and she thought about a name written on a marriage document, and a city in Kansas, and a warehouse fire in the winter of 1877. And she thought about a man who had left Dodge City and gone to Wyoming and Colorado, and then Nebraska, shedding a name somewhere along the way. She thought about Willa learning the names of stars. She covered the bread and went to find Nora Pickett. Nora Pickett ran the only proper boarding house in town, a 2-story building on the main street that was also, depending on the day and the season, a laundry concern, a place where you could get a tooth pulled with reasonable confidence, and the informal clearinghouse for every significant piece of information that moved through Harlan County. She was 58 years old and built like someone who had decided early in life that the world was going to require a great deal of her, and had arranged herself accordingly, solid, direct, with gray hair, pinned without vanity, and eyes that were the color of winter creek water, and just as clear. Elara had met her twice before, briefly, on provisions trips. Both times Nora had looked at her in the assessing way that Elara recognized because she employed it herself. And both times there had been the suggestion of something that wanted to be a conversation, but wasn't yet. She found Nora in the back room of the boarding house, rehanging a door that had warped in the cold, which she was doing herself with a plain and a practiced hand. "Mrs. Voss," Nora said without looking up. "Bread day at the ranch. You're not usually in town on Wednesdays." "I had an errand. The deputy was through earlier." "I know." Nora set the plane down. She looked at Elara with the creek water eyes and let the silence do what silence does when two people are deciding how honest to be with each other. "You know Callum Rhett," Elara said. Not a question. She'd been thinking about how to say this for the entire drive to town, and she'd decided that directness was the only approach that would work with a woman like Nora Pickett, and possibly the only approach that would work with a woman like herself. "I knew him before he went to Holt's," Nora said. "He stayed here 3 weeks in June between the Colorado work and whatever Holt was paying him for. And before Colorado, Nora picked up the plane again, turned it over in her hands. "I know who he is," she said, which was not the same as answering. "And I know what he did. And I know what he didn't do." She looked up. "Those are three different things." Ilara waited. "I'm not going to tell you the story," Nora said, "because it's his story and he should be the one to tell it or not tell it. And I expect he'll get there in his own time. What I will tell you is this." She set the plane down again and looked at Ilara with a directness that required meeting. "That young man has been carrying something for 9 years that doesn't belong to him. And the people who put it on him are either dead or old enough that they've forgotten they did it." A pause. "You understand what I mean by that?" "I think so," Ilara said. "Good. Now tell me something." Nora's expression didn't change, but something in it settled into a different configuration. "What are you planning to do with what you've figured out?" Ilara considered the question honestly. "Nothing yet," she said. "I'm still figuring out what I've figured out." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up the plane and went back to the door. "Come back when you know," she said. "I'll have coffee." She told Callum on a Thursday. Not deliberately or not entirely deliberately. She had been moving toward the conversation for 2 weeks, circling it the way she circled everything that mattered, approaching from different angles and testing the ground before she committed her weight to it. The Thursday timing was partly circumstance and partly the accumulation of pressure that builds when a person is keeping something, and the keeping of it starts to cost more than the telling would. He was mending a fence line at the near pasture alone in the flat gray light of a February afternoon. She had told Desmond she was going to check whether the fence near the creek had held through the last freeze, which was a reasonable thing to say, because it was a reasonable thing to worry about. She walked out with her coat buttoned to the chin and her breath making small clouds, and found Callum 3 posts along from where she'd expected him, working with a methodical patience that she'd come to recognize as his natural register. She stood a few feet away. He kept working. "Deputy Cole came through Wednesday," she said. "I know. He drove a staple without pausing. Desmond told me." "Did he tell you what Cole was looking for?" A pause then, just long enough to be informative. He set the fencing pliers down on the post and turned. His face in the cold light was the face she'd been reading for weeks. The settled jaw, the eyes that gave you information in small and careful increments. And it told her now that he had been expecting this. Not the conversation exactly, but something like it, some version of the reckoning that comes when the thing you've been carrying starts to have a visible weight. "What did you hear?" he said. "A name, a place, a year." She looked at him steadily. "I saw what you signed on the marriage papers." He looked back at her. He had very still eyes. She had always noticed this, not blank, not guarded in the brittle way of someone hiding something they're ashamed of, but still in the way of a person who has learned to keep the surface quiet so that other people can land on it without being thrown. "Then you know," he said. "I know a piece of it." She kept her voice even. This was important to her, not to come at it with heat, not to make him feel cornered, because a cornered man tells you what will stop the pressure, and not necessarily what is true. "I'd like to know the rest, if you want to tell it." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not. He looked at the fence line, then at the sky, which was carrying the flat pewter of late afternoon that would be dark in another hour. He picked up the pliers, looked at them, set them back on the post. "My father," he said. His name was Edmund Vere, the senior one. He said this with the particular precision of someone who has chosen their words in advance and is now deploying them carefully one at a time so nothing is lost and nothing is added that shouldn't be. He owned a commercial warehouse in Dodge City. It was failing, had been failing for 2 years. He'd borrowed against everything he had, including the insurance policy on the building, and he had run out of other ideas. Elara listened. January of 1877. I was 18. I was working nights at the warehouse, bookkeeping. I was better with numbers than with the cattle work, and he knew it and used it. He told me to go home early that night. He looked at the fence post. I didn't. I'd left a ledger book and I went back for it. I got to the building and it was already starting the fire. The smell of it, the way the air changes before you see the flame. He was quiet for a moment. He was still inside. I went in for him. I got him out, but it was already too much. He died at dawn. He picked up the pliers again. Didn't use them. The insurance company sent a man before my father's body was cold. There was an investigation. They needed someone to have done it deliberately because the alternative was paying out. I was 18 and I had been in the building that night, and there was no one alive who could account for my being there. Except me. He set the pliers down again. The sheriff in Dodge City was a close friend of the man who filed the insurance claim. I understood what was being built before it was finished, and I made the decision that I wasn't going to stand in the way of it. "You ran," Elara said. I ran. No apology in it and no pride. Just the plain fact. Wyoming first, then Colorado, then here. He looked at her. I changed the name in Colorado when I realized Cole had picked up the trail. It was either that or keep moving forever, and I was tired of moving. A pause. I thought I'd found a place where the trail would go cold. Elara considered everything he'd told her. She was holding it up against the light the way you hold a piece of glass, looking for the distortions, the places where the story didn't quite account for itself. She found very few. "Did your father," she said, "ever indicate to you in the way that a person sometimes does without saying it directly, that he knew what he was gonna do that night?" Callum looked at the horizon. Something moved in his face that he didn't try to stop. "There was a letter," he said, "that he wrote that I never received. Nora has it." Elara went still. She found it after she was running errands for the solicitor's office at the time, cataloging effects from the fire site. The letter was in a tin box that survived the fire. She didn't know who it was addressed to because I was already gone. She's kept it for 9 years. He looked at Elara with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the settled stillness. Something rawer and more recent. "She told me when I stayed at the boarding house last summer. She showed me the letter. It was addressed to me." He paused. He told the whole of it. What he'd done, why, what he'd hoped I wouldn't see. He didn't apologize exactly, but he told the truth of it. The wind came across the pasture with the particular flatness of Nebraska winter wind, which asks nothing from you and expects nothing in return. "He didn't mention me in it," Callum said. whether I had any part or didn't. He wrote as though I weren't in the equation. He said this without bitterness, or rather with the kind of steadiness that comes after bitterness has been processed and set aside. I've thought about that a lot. Ilara looked at him for a long time. "Do you want to know what I think?" she asked. "Yes. I think a man who is writing a letter to account for what he's done is not always capable of thinking past the accounting. The shame of it takes all the space." She paused. "That doesn't make the omission smaller, but it makes it less deliberate." Callum was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous reading." "I don't know if it is," she said. "It might just be an accurate one." The cold settled around them. In the west, the light was going down in the particular Nebraska way, not gradually, but all at once, as though someone had made a decision. "What will you do with it?" he asked. The same question Nora had asked. Coming from him, it had a different weight. "I don't know yet," she said. It was the same answer she'd given Nora. It was still true. He nodded as though this was sufficient. He picked up the pliers and went back to the fence, and she stood for another minute in the cold, and then walked back toward the house. And behind her she could hear the steady sound of the work continuing, the methodical, unhurried sound of a man doing what he came here to do in a place he had been trying to make into somewhere he could stay. Desmond knew something. She understood this 8 days after the fence line conversation. When he arrived at breakfast in a configuration she'd learned to read the particular quality of satisfaction in a man who is holding information and has decided the time to use it is approaching. It was visible in the way he sat, the way he spread his hands on the table, the way he asked her about the provision list with slightly more interest than the provision list warranted. She didn't know yet what he'd learned or how. She suspected the deputy's visit had triggered some inquiry made through channels she had no access to. She suspected also that whatever Desmond had discovered, he was treating it the way he treated every asset, something to be held until the moment of maximum return. She made a decision. She did not tell Callum that Desmond knew something. She wasn't ready to not, because she was protecting Desmond, but because the moment she told Callum something would begin moving that she hadn't yet figured out how to navigate, and she needed to understand the landscape before she started crossing it. What she did instead was go back to Nora. The provisions errand was legitimate this time. They needed baking soda and a new strainer, and 2 pounds of dried beans. She left Willa with the station wife who sometimes minded her when the drive to town was too cold, and she made the drive alone and found Nora in the boarding house parlor with the account books open, which she closed without ceremony when Ilara came in. "Desmond knows something," Ilara said. "I don't know how much." Nora poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked. She set them on the table between them and sat down with the directness of a woman who does not arrange herself for an audience. "He had a man in Broken Bow." "I didn't know he used," Nora said. "Word gets around. Your man wasn't as careful as he thought in his conversations." "He's not my man." Nora looked at her with the creek water eyes and said nothing which said something. Ilara wrapped her hands around the cup. "The letter," she said. "You said you'd kept it 9 years and didn't know who to give it to. Why not the sheriff's office?" "The sheriff's office in Dodge City in 1877 was..." Nora paused, looking for the exact word. "Partial. The insurance claim was filed by a man named Aldous Greer who had done business with the sheriff for 15 years. Giving that letter to the Dodge City sheriff would have been like giving it to Aldous Greer directly. She set her cup down. I wasn't gonna do that. I kept it because I didn't know what else to do with it, and because there was something in the old man's handwriting that told me it mattered. 30 years of running a boarding house teaches you the difference between things that matter and things that look like they matter. And now I have Deputy Cole, who is not from Dodge City, who was retained by an insurance company in Kansas City, that is not the same company and not the same interests as what happened in 1877. That changes the equation. She looked at Elara steadily. I'd be prepared to give him the letter, if the time came. Elara turned this over. The time coming depends on things I can't entirely control. Most things worth doing depend on things you can't entirely control, Nora said. Elara drank her coffee. Outside, the February wind was doing what it had been doing all month, moving across the county with a patience that had no opinion about any of the human concerns happening in its path. She thought about the letter in a tin box surviving a fire found by a woman doing someone else's errand, held for 9 years in a boarding house drawer, against the day when it would matter to the right person. He's going to move against Callum, she said. Desmond, when he's ready. Likely, Nora agreed. And against me if I'm in the way. She considered this. He told me 2 days ago that he'd been in contact with a buyer for the property. He mentioned Denver, which he mentioned when I first arrived. He said the sale would be finalized before summer. Nora went still. He also said, Elara continued, that the contract of our arrangement was specific to the operation of the Holt property in Harlan County, and that relocation to another state would constitute a change of terms requiring renegotiation. She paused, which I suspect means he intends to leave and leave us both behind, without the formality of a severance. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she went to the writing desk in the corner of the parlor and opened the bottom drawer and removed a folded document. She set it on the table in front of Elara without preamble. 3 years ago, she said, Desmond Holt borrowed money against a parcel that doesn't appear in his formal ranch holdings. 40 acres on the southwest corner between his south pasture and the creek. He needed the money quickly and didn't want the formal bank process, so he came to me. She sat down again. The loan is past due by 22 months. I haven't moved on it because I'm an old woman who doesn't need 40 acres of Nebraska grassland. But the note is valid and witnessed and recorded with the county clerk, which I made sure of at the time, because I've been in the business of loans long enough to know that gentlemen and their word are not the same thing. Elara looked at the document. Then she looked at Nora. You've been waiting, she said. I've been patient, Nora said, which she seemed to consider a distinction worth making. There's a difference. Elara read the document. She was a woman who had grown up in a household where her father, a printer, a man of text and precision, had taught her that the language of a document is not decoration, but architecture, and that every clause does a specific job, and you ignore them at your cost. She read it 3 times. She looked up. This is leverage, she said. It is. Against a man who is very skilled at not being leveraged. Yes, Nora said, which is why you'd need a lawyer and time and the willingness to be in the middle of something uncomfortable for a while. She paused. Do you have those things? Elara thought about the room off the kitchen, about the breakfast table and the eyes that moved past Willa as though she weren't there, about the specific mathematics of what it had cost her to get here, and what it would cost her to be sent away with nothing. Yes, she said. She folded the document and put it in her coat pocket and stood up and buttoned the coat against the cold that would be waiting for her outside. One more thing, Nora said. Elara waited. The boy is a good man, Nora said. I don't say that easily, and I don't say it often. I'm telling you because you should have accurate information. She picked up her coffee cup. And because you've got the look of someone who is working very hard at not knowing something she already knows. Elara stood in the boarding house parlor with the folded document in her pocket and the cold waiting outside, and Nora Pickett watching her with the patience of someone who has nowhere to be and no particular interest in making things easier than they are. I'll think about it, Elara said. I know you will, Nora said. That's the problem. The evening she came back from town with the document in her pocket was the evening Desmond chose to make the announcement formal. He did it at dinner. He had set the table himself, which she had never seen him do, and he was in a better suit than the occasion warranted. And when she sat down across from him, she understood before he said a word that the version of the conversation she had been preparing for had arrived. He told her about the sale with the care of a man presenting a fait accompli, not asking, not discussing, simply informing in the way that people with power often confuse informing with consulting. The buyer was a cattle operation out of Omaha. The price was satisfactory. The transaction would be complete by the 1st of May. He looked at her when he had finished with the look of a man who has delivered news he considers adequate and is now waiting for the appropriate response. And my situation, Elara said. He explained it with the same measured reasonableness he brought to all difficult pronouncements. The contract, the geographic specificity, the logistical realities of a relocation that did not account for dependence. He used the word dependence, not Willa's name, not her daughter. Dependence. She kept her face neutral. She was very good at this. And Callum Rhett, she asked. Something moved behind Desmond's eyes, quick and deliberate like a card being placed face down. Callum is a ranch hand, he said. There will be no position for him with the new owners who are bringing their own operation up from Omaha. His employment ends with the sale. She nodded slowly as though she were considering this. She was not considering it. She had already made the calculations she needed to make on the drive back from town. In the flat gray light of a February afternoon with the document folded against her chest, and she had arrived at the particular clarity that comes when a person stops hoping for a situation to improve and starts deciding what to do about it. She did not tell him about the document that night. She wasn't ready. Not yet. But as she cleared the dishes and went to check on Willa asleep in the room off the kitchen, her breathing slow and certain in the way of children who haven't yet learned to carry the night's worries into their sleep, she felt the paper's edge through the fabric of her coat hung on the hook by the door. She had been here 6 weeks. She had come with 2 traveling cases and a 4-year-old and the willingness to be useful. And she had understood from the beginning that the door she was walking through was not the door it had been described as. She had been right about that. She had been right about most of it. What she had not anticipated, what she was still working to account for, was the man in the barn who left milk on the porch and had spent 9 years carrying something that didn't belong to him, and who had stood beside her in the kitchen without being asked and hadn't mentioned it since, because for him, it was simply what a person did when a person could. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark room. Willa's breathing was steady and small and entirely real. She was not, she told herself, doing any of this for him. She was doing it for Willa and for herself, and for the plain principle that a person who walks through a door and does the work the door requires should not be turned out with nothing at the end of it. That was the reason. That was the whole of it. She went to sleep believing this, which meant she was not yet quite ready to believe anything else. And that was all right. That was enough to start. 2 weeks after Desmond's announcement at dinner with the February ground still frozen underfoot, Elara filed the petition on a Tuesday. March came to Nebraska the way it always does not, with the gentle thaw that people elsewhere associate with the turning of seasons, but as a negotiation between winter and something that hasn't yet decided to be spring. The snow that fell in the first week was different from February snow. It fell and then considered itself. It melted at the edges in the afternoon and froze again at night. And in the mornings the yard was covered in a crust that broke underfoot with a sound like something making up its mind. The lawyer in Broken Bow was a man named Aldrich, 40 years old, with the careful eyes of someone who had seen enough of the territory's informal arrangements to know that what the law said and what people did were frequently different countries. He had taken the case with a particular quality of attention, not enthusiasm exactly, but the focused interest of a man who recognizes an unusual problem and finds unusual problems worth his time. The petition was for annulment on the grounds of material misrepresentation in the terms of the arrangement, and for recovery of the debt secured against the 40-acre parcel per the note held by Nora Pickett. Aldrich had explained to her with the plainness she appreciated in people who knew things she didn't, that the first petition was the harder one. Nebraska law in 1886 was not organized around the comfort of women who found their arrangements unsatisfactory. The annulment would require demonstrating that the misrepresentation was substantial and documented. The debt recovery was cleaner. The note was valid. The default was clear. The county record was in order. "You'll likely win the debt case," he had told her. "The annulment is less certain. It depends on who hears it and what morning they're having." "Then we file both," she had said. She had not told Callum. She had told herself this was practical, that involving him complicated the legal picture, that the fewer people who knew the details, the less chance Desmond had of receiving advance information. Both of these things were true. They were not the only reasons, and she was honest enough with herself to know it, though she did not press on the other reasons with any force. She came back from Broken Bow in the early afternoon and found Willa in the kitchen with Desmond's housekeeper, an elderly woman named Mrs. Garth, who came twice a week and had the quality of someone who has long since decided to find everything mildly unsurprising. She collected Willa and went about the remainder of the day's work. And at dinner, Desmond spoke about the Omaha buyers coming to walk the property at the end of the month, and she listened and responded at the appropriate intervals and gave nothing away. She had gotten very good at giving nothing away. She did not know Callum had gone to see Cole until he didn't come back for supper. This was not in itself unusual. Ranch work had its own hours and its own emergencies, and Callum was a man who did not arrange his schedule around mealtimes. But there was a quality to his absence that evening that was different from his ordinary absences, a texture to it, some vacancy in the usual pattern of sounds from the direction of the barn that her body registered before her mind caught up. She put Willa to bed. She waited. She was good at waiting, had been good at it. Her whole life had in fact come to understand it as a skill rather than a deficiency. The ability to remain still inside a situation while information accumulated. At 9 o'clock, Mrs. Garth, who sometimes stayed late when the weather threatened, appeared in the kitchen doorway and said that Deputy Cole had been to the ranch that afternoon while Elara was in town, that Mr. Rhett had spoken to him on the South Road, that the two of them had ridden toward town together an hour before supper. Elara stood at the kitchen window for a long time after Mrs. Garth went home. She had not asked him to do this. She had not suggested it. She had been managing the situation with the careful triangulation. She applied to all important things Nora, the lawyer, the document, the patience required to let each piece settle into its correct position before moving to the next. She had been doing this entirely. She realized now, without accounting for the possibility that Callum Rhett might make his own calculation and arrive at his own conclusion on his own schedule. She did not know what he had told Cole. She did not know what Cole had done with it. She did not know whether the 9-year-old question of Edmund Vare was about to become the thing that decided everything, or the thing that collapsed everything. And she would not know until morning, and morning was a long time away. She went to bed. She did not sleep until very late. And when she did, it was the shallow surface sleep of a person whose attention hasn't entirely agreed to the arrangement. He came back before dawn. She heard the horse in the yard, heard it with the particular alertness of someone who has been listening for a specific sound without admitting they were listening for it. And she was at the kitchen window before she decided to be there. The yard was dark, the stars still out in the west where the night was holding on. She watched him unsaddle the horse and walk it into the barn with the deliberate movements of someone who is tired and managing the tiredness. She put the coffee on. He came to the kitchen door 20 minutes later. He knocked, which he had never done before, and she understood that the knocking was a kind of information that he knew something had shifted, that he was being careful about the terms of his entry. She opened the door. He looked like a man who had spent 12 hours being very honest and was not yet sure whether it had been the right thing. His face had the quality she associated with people who have set something down after a long time of carrying it. Not lightness exactly, but a rawness where the weight had been. She poured the coffee. She set it in front of him and sat across the table. Cole had the authority from the Kansas City company, he said. Not Dodge City. Different jurisdiction. She waited. I told him the whole of it. What my father did, what I saw, why I left. He took it down. He looked at the coffee cup. He said the insurance company in Kansas City has been trying to close the case for 5 years. That the original claim was filed fraudulently by the insured by my father, but that the fraud doesn't extend to me because there's no evidence of my participation, and there never was. He paused. The Dodge City Sheriff's investigation was irregular. Cole used that word several times, irregular. Elara let the information settle. He's keeping me here pending verification, Callum continued. He'll send to Kansas City and wait for the response. It could be 2 weeks, could be a month. He looked up from the cup. If the verification comes back the way he thinks it will, the matter is closed. And if it doesn't, then I'll deal with what it is. He said this without drama, without the particular performance of stoicism that some men use as armor. Just a plain statement of a plain intention. She looked at him across the table in the kitchen, where she had made every meal for 6 weeks, and where the fire had learned her habits and burned accordingly. You didn't tell me you were going, she said. No. Why? He considered this. Because you've been managing everything, he said. Carefully in order the way you do things. I didn't want to complicate your sequence. He paused. And because I decided I was done waiting for a better moment. 9 years is a long time to wait for a better moment. He looked at her steadily. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. The kitchen was quiet. Through the walls, somewhere in the depth of the house, the clock on the mantel in the main room counted itself forward. Was it something I said, she asked, that made you decide? He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. The fence line, he said. When you asked if I had regrets, and I said when I ran, it was the only choice I had left, but that I had regrets now. He looked at his hands on the table. I've been saying that I had regrets for a year, saying it to myself. This was the first time I said it to another person, and after I said it, it became a different kind of true, the kind that requires something. He looked up. Does that make sense? Yes, she said. It does. She got up and refilled his coffee, even though it wasn't empty yet, because she needed something to do with her hands for a moment. And when she sat back down, she said, the petition was filed yesterday. He went still. Aldrich in Broken Bow. Annulment on misrepresentation grounds and recovery of the debt Desmond owes Nora for the 40-acre parcel. She watched his face. I've been working on it for 3 weeks. Something moved in his expression that she couldn't entirely read. Not surprised, she thought, so much as the recognition of something he had suspected, but not confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. The annulment, he said. What are the chances? Aldrich says uncertain. Depends on who hears it and how the morning is going. She paused. The debt case is cleaner. And if you win the debt case but not the annulment, then I have leverage I didn't have before, and I use it. She met his eyes. I'm not leaving Nebraska with nothing. That's what I decided the day Cole came through. He looked at her for a long moment, not the quick, assessing look, but the longer, more careful one, the look of a man taking an accurate measure of something he doesn't want to get wrong. You were doing all of this while I was watching you make bread, he said. I make good bread, she said. The two things aren't mutually exclusive. Something shifted in his face. Then a small, unexpected thing. The corner of his mouth moving in a way she hadn't seen before, a way that suggested he knew very well how to smile, and was choosing to briefly. And the smile changed his face the way good light changes a landscape, not making it different, but revealing what was already there. She looked away first. Desmond found out about the petition on a Friday. She had expected him to find out Broken Bow was not a large town, and Aldrich was not the only lawyer in it. And Desmond had connections to the county apparatus that he had spent 20 years cultivating precisely for moments like this one. What she had not expected was the particular form his response took. He did not come to her directly. He went to the newspaper. The Harlan County Courier was a weekly paper of modest circulation and immodest enthusiasm for local affairs. And by Saturday afternoon, it had a brief item on its front page, noting that a ranch hand employed by Holt Ranch one Callum Rhett had been identified by a territorial deputy as a person of interest in a 9-year-old arson investigation, originating in Dodge City, Kansas. The item gave no further details, which was worse than details would have been. It left the shape of the thing without the substance of it, which meant every person who read it filled the gap with what their imagination suggested. Desmond had known about the arson inquiry. He had been holding it in reserve exactly as she'd suspected, keeping it banked against the day when it would do the most damage at the least cost to himself. The petition had moved that calculation. It was his countermove. She found out about the newspaper item from Mrs. Garth, who brought it with the same mild, unsurprised delivery she brought everything. And Alara read it standing in the kitchen with her coat still on from the morning's tasks. She read it twice. She folded it. She put it in the pocket of her coat next to where the loan document had been. She went to find Callum. He was in the barn with the sorrel working on the horse's off forehoof with a hoof pick and a focused attention that she recognized as the particular concentration of someone who is doing a careful thing and thinking about something else. She stood in the barn doorway with the folded newspaper in her hand and the cold at her back. He looked up. She walked in and set the paper on the hay bale beside him without saying anything. He set the hoof pick down. He read the item. He read it once, which told her he was a fast reader and that the content was not surprising to him. And then he set the paper on the hay bale with a care that was more deliberate than the paper warranted. He was going to use it eventually, he said. Yes. Does it change anything? She had been thinking about this since Mrs. Garth's visit. She had been sitting with the question the way she sat, with all important questions, not pushing it toward an answer, but letting it find its own level. For the petition, maybe, she said. Aldrich will need to know. It could affect how the morning is going when the judge sees it. She paused. For everything else, no. He looked at her. You're sure? I've been married to a man I knew thoroughly, she said. I knew his family and his history and his people going back 2 generations. I knew every face he made and what each one meant. I knew him the way you know a place you've lived in for years. She held his gaze. It didn't tell me anything useful about what he would do when it mattered. Callum was still. I know what you did when it mattered, she said. 6 weeks of it. That's what I have to go on. I'll go on it. She picked up the newspaper from the hay bale and took it with her when she left so that Willa wouldn't find it and ask questions she wasn't ready to answer yet. The first hearing was on a Wednesday in late March. Aldrich had warned her. He had warned her that the judge assigned to the case was a man with settled opinions about contractual arrangements entered into by women and about what constituted material misrepresentation versus ordinary disappointment. and he had warned her that the first hearing was likely to produce a procedural obstacle rather than a resolution. And he had been correct on both counts. The judge, a man in his 60s whose face suggested he had long since concluded that the law was a fixed object and that people who found it inconvenient were. The problem looked at the petition with the attention of someone looking for the fastest route to a predetermined destination. He found it. The annulment petition was deficient, he said, in its specificity regarding the nature of the misrepresentation. He would require amended documentation within 30 days. She sat in the small courthouse in Broken Bow and listened to this and did not alter her expression. Aldrich put his hand briefly on the papers in front of him, a gesture that communicated to her without words that this was anticipated and managed, and not the end of the road. She nodded once. She stood up when the judge indicated the session was concluded, and she walked out of the courthouse into the March air, which was cold still but had a quality in it that February hadn't, some faint promise of something not yet nameable. She stood on the steps and looked at the main street of Broken Bow, which was just a street, just a collection of wooden buildings along a dirt road in a county in Nebraska as ordinary as anything she had ever seen. She thought about her father's print shop in Cambridge, a house where the gap between what a thing was and how it was described was a professional concern. She had internalized this without knowing she was, and it had made her perhaps too patient with situations that deserved faster responses. She went to find Nora. It was Nora who brought the letter to Cole. She had decided this on her own. Elara found out afterward, not before, and she had done it on the same Wednesday as the hearing. Cole was not from Dodge City. That had always been the condition she was waiting for. She arrived at Cole's temporary office in the Broken Bow Hotel with the directness of a woman who has been waiting 9 years for the appropriate moment, and is determined that the appropriate moment is now. She had the letter in a waxed envelope that had kept it dry through 2 hard Nebraska winters and 7 years in a boarding house drawer. She had the documentation of how she'd found it and where it had been kept and why she hadn't acted on it before, which she gave to Cole in the form of a written statement that Aldrich had helped her draft the previous week. Cole had read the letter in Nora's presence. He had read the statement. He had asked 3 questions which Nora answered. He had thanked her and told her he would be in contact with Kansas City and that the situation might resolve faster than he'd previously indicated. Elara found out about all of this when she went to Nora's that afternoon and found Cole already gone and Nora in her parlor with the particular settled quality of someone who has done a thing they needed to do. "You could have told me," Elara said. "I could have," Nora agreed. "I decided not to because you had enough to carry this morning and because I knew what the letter would do and I didn't want you to feel responsible for it." She poured coffee. "The letter is what it is. It was always going to go to Cole eventually. I just needed the right Cole." Elara sat down. She was tired in the way of a person who has been managing many things for a long time and is beginning to feel the accumulated weight of the management, not defeated, not uncertain about the direction, just tired. "What does it do?" she asked. "For Callum. And if Kansas City accepts the letter as conclusive and Aldrich thinks they will because the letter names the specific accelerant and the specific location and the time of setting information that only the person who set the fire would know, then the inquiry closes." The Dodge City investigation was always thin. The insurance company didn't need Callum prosecuted. They needed the fraud documented so they could close the file. Nora set her cup down. He's not what they were looking for. He never was. He was just the person who was there. The room was quiet. Outside, a cart went past on the main street, the horse's hooves on the still frozen mud, making the flat sound of early spring. 9 years, Elara said. People carry things a long time, Nora said. Sometimes because they have to. Sometimes because the carrying becomes the habit before they notice. She looked at Elara with the creek-water eyes that had seen she suspected a very great deal. Sometimes someone else has to set the thing down for them. Elara thought about this. She thought about a warehouse in Dodge City in January 1877, and a boy of 18 going back for a ledger book he'd left behind, and the smell of a fire starting in the dark. She thought about what it cost to carry that for 9 years. Not the guilt of having done it, but the weight of being assumed to have done it by a world that had already made up its mind. She thought about the discipline that kind of carrying required, the specific self-containment it produced in a person, the habits of economy that develop when you have learned that every unnecessary word is a potential exposure. She thought about small things left at a kitchen door: milk, wood, dried apples. She finished her coffee and drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon light. And when she arrived, she found Willa in the yard with her coat on, carefully explaining something to the barn cat, who was listening with the polite incomprehension of barn cats throughout history. Elara sat on the porch step and watched her daughter, and felt the March air on her face, and waited. The response from Kansas City came in 11 days. Cole brought it himself, which told her something about how he'd evaluated the situation. He came to the ranch on a Thursday morning when Desmond was out inspecting the south pasture with a buyer's representative who had arrived from Omaha the day before. Cole asked to speak to Callum. She brought Callum to the main room and stood in the kitchen doorway, which was close enough to hear. Cole read from the document with the careful monotone of official procedure. The Kansas City Insurance Company had reviewed the letter of Edmund Vare Sr., authenticated by a handwriting comparison with existing records, and had determined that the fire of January 1877 was set by the insured party without the knowledge or participation of Edmund Vare Jr. The inquiry was closed. There were no pending charges, no open warrants, and no further action required by the territorial office. Callum stood in the main room of a house that had never been his and listened to 9 years being officially set down. Cole folded the document. He looked at Callum with a straightforward, professional regard that had something behind it. Not sympathy exactly, but the look of a man who has been in the territory long enough to understand that what the law produces and what justice looks like are not always the same thing, and who has made his peace with the gap between them. "That's the end of it," Cole said. "Yes," Callum said. "Thank you." Cole left. Elara waited in the kitchen doorway. Callum stood in the main room for a moment with his hat in his hands, not moving in the way of someone who has been braced for a long time and is only now beginning to take account of the fact that the bracing is no longer required. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the silence wasn't already saying better. After a while, he put his hat on and went back to the barn. Desmond came back from the south pasture in the early afternoon and learned from Mrs. Garth, who had arrived for her twice-weekly visit, that the deputy had been to the ranch. He appeared in the kitchen doorway at 2 o'clock, with the particular quality of a man who has gone to execute a plan and found the ground shifted under him. He looked at Alara. She was making bread. She had learned over 6 weeks that bread was useful when she needed something to do with her hands, while she thought clearly. And she was thinking clearly now, with a precision that had taken all morning to assemble, and that she intended to use carefully. "The petition goes to amended hearing in 3 weeks, she said, without looking up from the dough. Aldrich believes we have sufficient documentation for the misrepresentation claim. He's identified 2 prior correspondence instances where your description of the arrangement's terms is inconsistent with what I found here." She paused. "He also notes that the debt claim is straightforward and will likely be adjudicated in the same session." The kitchen was quiet. She worked the dough. "The 40 acres will go to Nora," she said. "That's what the note specifies. What she does with it after is her matter." She looked up. "But she has indicated a willingness to lease it on favorable terms to a tenant of her choosing. I am the tenant she has in mind." Desmond stood in the doorway. He was a large man, and the doorway framed him in a way that was intended to be imposing, and had been imposing over the weeks in the way of all things that are large and certain of themselves. She looked at him now, with the clear eyes of someone who has stopped being impressed by size. "The buyer's from Omaha," he said. His voice had the measured quality of a man trying to locate his advantages. "We'll buy the ranch," she said, "which is your land and your business. I'm not contesting the sale." She set the dough aside. "I'm contesting what I was told the arrangement was and what it turned out to be. Those are different matters, and one of them doesn't affect the other." He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him do the calculation, saw it in the set of his jaw, the way his eyes moved to some middle distance and came back. He was adding up what a legal contest would cost him against what he stood to gain from it. And he was finding, as men like him often found, when they did the arithmetic honestly, that the numbers didn't favor the fight. "The newspaper item," he said. "Is what it is," she said. "Cole's response from Kansas City closes the inquiry. Anyone who reads the follow-up, if there is one, will have the full picture." She paused. "Anyone who doesn't read the follow-up will have an incomplete picture. That's the nature of newspapers." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked back through the main room toward his office, and she heard the office door close with the careful quietness of a man who is not going to give her the satisfaction of a slam. She put the bread in the oven and stood with her hands on the counter and let herself feel briefly the full weight of what the last 3 weeks had required of her. Not triumph. She had learned to be suspicious of triumph, which tended to arrive before the consequences did. But a solid, settled clarity, the kind that comes when you have done what you set out to do and can see that you did it in a way you won't regret. The bread needed 40 minutes. She went to find Willa. The second hearing produced what Aldrich had said it would likely produce. The judge was not the same judge. The original had a conflicting matter in another county. The replacement was a woman, one of only 3 in territorial Nebraska, a fact that the clerk mentioned to Alara with the tone of someone noting a curiosity, and Alara received with the tone of someone receiving useful information. The amended documentation was complete. The 2 instances of inconsistent correspondence were entered into record. The loan note was presented and verified. The annulment was granted on misrepresentation grounds. The 40-acre parcel was ordered returned to Nora per the terms of the defaulted note. Ilara sat in the courthouse and heard both determinations made in the flat procedural language of the law, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been held in place since the morning she had walked into a house and seen a room off a kitchen. She did not cry. She was not particularly a person who cried, though she respected the practice in others. She sat and listened, and when it was over, she shook Aldrich's hand and thanked him, and went outside into an April morning that had finally, without any fanfare, decided to be spring. The air was different. It had been different for a week since the last of the frost left the ground, and the grass began its hesitant return, pale green coming up through the dead gold of last year's growth. The way all returns come quietly underneath things, before anyone is ready to announce them. She stood on the courthouse steps and breathed it. She found Desmond in his office that afternoon. She had not sought this conversation, but she had known it was coming. Had known it the way she knew most things that mattered by the accumulated weight of what hadn't been said yet. She knocked and he told her to come in, and she stood across the desk from him in the office with its surveyor maps and its account books and its evidence of 20 years of a man making a place respond to his will. He looked older than he had in January. Not much, but some. The kind of older that comes not from time, but from the specific fatigue of finding out that a calculation you were confident in was wrong. "The sale closes May 1st, he said. There was nothing in his voice that she could call gracious, but there was also nothing she would have called further hostility. He was a practical man. The arithmetic had concluded. "I know," she said. "The room off the kitchen is yours until then." She nodded. He looked at the surface of the desk. "I didn't—" He stopped. He was not a man who apologized. She understood this, and she was not going to wait for him to become one. "The arrangement wasn't what I represented it to be," he said. This was the closest he was gonna get. "No," she said. "It wasn't." She left him in the office with his account books and his 20 years of a ranch he was about to sell to strangers from Omaha. She didn't feel sorry for him, but she didn't feel victorious either. She felt something more accurate than either the plain recognition of a situation that had been what it was handled as well as it could be handled, and now concluded. The evening of the day the hearing concluded, she and Callum sat on the porch steps of the main house. Willa had found that the barn cat had produced kittens in the hay, a development she treated as evidence of a fundamentally orderly and generous universe. And she had spent the last hour in detailed negotiation with the mother cat regarding visiting rights. The mother cat was maintaining her position with dignity. Willa respected this, but was not deterred. Ilara had told Callum about the hearing on the drive back from town. He had listened with the focused attention he brought to information that mattered. He had said, "Good." One word in the tone of a man who means it entirely. Now they sat on the porch steps in the April evening, the first evening in months that didn't require a coat, and the light was the particular clear gold of early spring at 6 o'clock in the Great Plains, which travels across the landscape with a generosity that winter withholds for months and then releases all at once. "What will you do?" he said, with the lease on the 40 acres. Build, she said. There's nothing on it. I know. She looked at the light on the grass. That's the point. He was quiet for a moment. There's a line shack on the Morrison parcel that backs up against that land, empty since last fall. He paused. I've been looking at work in the county. Morrison's foreman position is open. They offered it to me last month. She turned her head and looked at him. I told them I needed to know how some things landed before I could give them an answer, he said. He met her eyes. Things have landed. She looked at him for a long time. She was thinking about what it costs to say yes to things when you have learned what the cost of saying yes can be. She was thinking about a room off a kitchen and a man who hadn't looked at her daughter. She was thinking about a man who crouched down to talk to a child at eye level in a train station and left milk on a porch in February and stood beside her in a kitchen without being asked. She was thinking about the thing Nora had said, that she had the look of someone working very hard at not knowing something she already knew. She had been working very hard at it. It had been, she thought, the most sustained effort of a life that had required considerable sustained effort. The 40 acres will need fencing, she said, and a well, and a structure that isn't a tent. Yes, he said. That's a significant amount of work. It is. I don't know how to do most of it. I do, he said. He was not, she noticed, smiling. This wasn't charm, not performance, not the specific energy of a man trying to persuade. It was simply the direct statement of a practical man assessing a practical problem. Some of it you'll learn as we go. It's not complicated. It's mostly just a lot of it. She looked at the April light moving across the grass. She thought about Boston, which felt like something that had happened to a different person, which was probably accurate. She thought about Frederick, who had been decent and then absent and then gone, and about the grief of losing him, which had been real and was also finished. She thought about the train platform in Broken Bow in January and the pewter sky and the silence that had felt like the edges being taken off everything. She thought about what Callum had said at the fence line when she'd asked if he regretted running. That when he ran it had been the only choice he had left, but that he had regrets now. That when he'd said it to another person, it became a different kind of true, the kind that requires something. She understood that. She understood it the way she understood most important things, not by reasoning her way to it, but by recognizing that she'd known it for a while and had been managing the knowing until the moment when the managing was no longer necessary. Willa will need to know, she said. Yes. She'll want a dog. He considered this gravely. That seems reasonable. And she'll want to learn to ride. Also reasonable. She'll have opinions about everything. I've noticed, he said. The corner of his mouth moved in the way she was learning to read that small and genuine shift. The smile that arrived without announcing itself. I think it's one of her better qualities. Ilara looked at her daughter across the yard, who had achieved some detente with the mother cat and was now sitting in the hay with a small orange kitten in her lap, and the specific expression of someone who has gotten exactly what she came for and is aware of it. She felt something open in her chest that she hadn't known was still closed. Not a rush, not an arrival, Not the thing that novels described. Something quieter. The feeling of a door that has been latched for a long time, not locked. Never locked, but held shut against the weather, and now the weather has changed and the hand on the latch can let go. She looked at Callum beside her. He was looking at Willa. "Yes," she said. He turned. "To the Morrison position," she said. "And the rest of it." Yes. He looked at her the way he looked at things that mattered, the full, careful attention of a man who does not want to get something important wrong. And then he nodded once, the nod of someone receiving information they intended to act on for the rest of their life. They moved to the 40 acres in May when the sale of the Holt Ranch closed, and the Omaha men came with their operation from the south. Callum took the Morrison position. The line shack on the adjoining parcel was small and roughly kept, but the bones of it were sound. He said this the first time he walked through it, running his hand along the wall the way a person touches something they're disarming to trust, and she understood that he was right. Good bones. Everything else was just time and work. The first week they patched the roof. The second week they dug out the foundation of a well that a previous occupant had started and abandoned at 3 feet. The work was hard and specific and required more of them than either had anticipated, which was true of all worthwhile things. Willa carried water and supervised and offered opinions on all decisions which were not always correct, but were always earnest. And the Morrison men came by twice with tools and an hour of help in the way of communities that are not sentimental about assistance, but practice it anyway. Nora came on a Sunday with a wagon full of things that she said she was tired of storing. And that happened to be exactly what a house needs. In its first weeks, a stove part, 2 chairs, a window frame that fit the gap in the south wall, as though it had been made for it, which Ilara suspected was not an accident. Willa got a dog. This was inevitable. It was a cattle dog of mixed parentage that had belonged to a Morrison hand who was moving on, and it arrived with the name Pepper and the energy of an animal that has decided it has found its people and intends to make itself indispensable. It succeeded. On an evening in June when the light was long and the grass had come fully back to itself, Ilara stood on the threshold of the structure that was becoming a house and looked at what they had done. The well was finished. The roof was sound. The south wall had its window now, and in the evening the light came through it at an angle that lit the interior with the particular gold of Nebraska summer evenings, which is one of the things the state offers in compensation for everything else it requires. Callum was inside working on the floor. The boards were old, and some of them needed replacing, and he was working his way from the east wall toward the door with the methodical patience that characterized all his work. The sound of it was the sound she had been hearing for 6 weeks. Regular, purposeful, the sound of something being made right. She looked at the 40 acres. Not all of it was visible from here. It stretched south toward the creek and east toward the Morrison boundary fence, but she knew the shape of it now, having walked it many times in the weeks since the hearing. She knew where the ground was soft and where it was reliable. She knew where the wind came from in the evening and how the light moved across it in the afternoon. She knew it the way you know a place that is becoming yours, not all at once, not through declaration, but through the accumulated daily intimacy of being in it. She heard Callum set down his hammer behind her. "Floor," she said without turning. "East half is done." A pause. "Come look." She turned and went inside. The boards he'd replaced were lighter than the old ones not yet weathered to the same color, which gave the floor a patchwork quality that would even out over years. He was kneeling at the edge of the finished section, checking the last joint, and she crouched beside him and looked at the work. And it was good work, clean and tight. She picked up the second hammer from where he'd set it on the hay bale they were using as a workbench. She looked at the remaining section of floor. She had learned most of what she knew about this kind of work in the past 6 weeks, which meant she knew enough to do it slowly and correctly. "Show me where to start," she said. He moved to the next section. She followed. He demonstrated the angle and the force, and she tried it, and it wasn't quite right. And he adjusted her grip once with the impersonal efficiency of someone correcting a technique. And then it was right, and the sound it made was the sound of something going into its correct place. They worked. Outside, the June light moved across the Nebraska grassland in the long, slow manner of summer evenings, and Willa played in the yard with Pepper, who had decided that the correct game was a variation on chase that involved the dog running first one direction and then the other, while Willa stood in the middle and laughed. And the sound of it came through the open doorway with the easy familiarity of something that has found its natural home. The tin box sat on the shelf Callum had built against the east wall. The box where Elara kept the lease documentation and the annulment record and the deed transfer note that established the 40 acres as hers. In the county record in her name, only her name, Elara Voss. She had looked at those papers many times in the past weeks, and each time they had told her the same true thing, that this was the first document in her life that belonged entirely to her and could not be taken by the action or inaction or absence of anyone else. She was 23 years old. She had come from Boston with 2 cases and a 4-year-old and the willingness to walk through a door without knowing what was on the other side. She had found what was on the other side, and she had dealt with it, and she had built something from what remained. The hammer in her hand was the right weight for the work. She was learning its balance. The floor needed doing, and the evening was long, and there was time.